and we took, we could glow in the dark. And when we dreamed of danger. All the ways our bodies can fall apart. 'Cause when it breaks, it'll break your heart. When it breaks, it'll break your heart. When it breaks, it'll break your heart. When it breaks, it'll break your heart.
All right, well, hi there, everybody. Here we are, back at the beginning, sort of. I just thought that on our last video, we should try to end the class the way we began it, back here at the beginning. However, of course, the world is a very different place when we end this class than it was when we started. And that's going to be one of the major themes of this particular last lecture, because I want to look a little bit at some of the economic drivers of kind of where globalization comes from, but also want to talk a little bit about how in this world that has been very much turned upside down this semester, what is the future of not just globalization as a process, but what is the future of the interconnections between different parts of the world, not just economically, not just politically, but also just person to person. How are we going to move through the world when this is all said and done? And the good news is this pandemic will end, and there will be effects of that. But there's important questions about how exactly we're all going to move forward. And so that's some of the things that I'm hoping to address in this lecture. And I thought that I'd at least introduce it here, back where we began, with a little bit of Australian jangle pop music to start us off. That's with the band The Quivers, by the way. They're like super awesome if you don't know Quivers. Huge Quivers fan. So anyway, but let's go ahead and get to it. I'm going to pause this and then start in on the content. All right, so let's go ahead and just finish up then the material that we have for this semester and this lesson, which is to really think about what's the future of globalization after this kind of pandemic that we're seeing right now. I mean, obviously globalization had a big impact on facilitating this pandemic. If anything else, it showed that the entire world is completely connected. If you go and look at the maps these days that show where coronavirus is, it's absolutely everywhere. I believe this is a little bit old here, but I believe now it's in 177 countries, meaning almost every single country in the world. And almost every, now every state in the United States has it, and most counties have it as well. And so it shows that what starts in one place in the world diffuses and goes everywhere, right? And it shows how interconnected everything really is. And so one of the places where I want to end this is think back earlier in the semester when we were talking about population and the concept of biopower and biopolitics. If you recall, there was this idea that when governments are trying to manage what their populations are doing, and this is really important when we think about pandemics and health, remember that there was this big shift in what power was about with countries. Back around the time of what they call the Treaty of Westphalia, back in the 1600s in Europe. And the idea was this, is that governments were really interested in being able to make sure that their populations were productive. Now remember, the reason why, however, they were wanting people to be productive is that they wanted to compete with rival countries. And the way you did this was capturing the productivity of living people. And there's two parts to this. One is, yes, you had to make sure they were healthy, and you had to make sure that they were educated, and all these sort of things. But the other thing you had to do was to be able to make sure that they showed up at work and that you could take the work that they did and sort of capture the value that they were producing, right? If you're a leader of a country or of a leader of a big industry. Right now, you can see, well, again, there's this idea that, you do this stuff like public health and discipline and all this stuff, but you're governing a population, not necessarily to protect either the government or even to protect the people, but to produce and to be able to get your hands on that production. And this is one of the key things that has kind of gone awry with this pandemic, because on one level, governments have failed in that they have not been able to keep their people healthy. However, if you send everybody home and have them in quarantine, like we are currently, they're also not being productive, and you're not capturing the productivity. And so there's this really big kind of debate going on about how soon do we kind of force people to go back to work. Because the other thing is, if you tell people to go back to work too soon and they get sick, then you're not being productive or capturing their productivity either. But it's creating all of these very big tensions, right? And so you see things with like the stock market going down, or people, Donald Trump and some others have been talking about like, well, they wanted at first to open up the country by Easter, but then people thought that was pushing it. And then Trump later said, okay, yeah, we really can't open that soon. But there's also this discussion about we can't let the cure be worse than the problem. In other words, we can't lose all that productivity. And this is very much what they call a biopower or biopolitical perspective, where it's not just about the health of people, it's about making sure they're productive and capturing it. And right now, that is not happening, either because people are unhealthy or because they're not showing up at work. And so the pandemic sort of attacks sort of both sides of the logics of biopolitics. And so because we have this crisis right now where people are not being productive and the major industries and governments are not able to kind of capture some of that productivity, there's all these thoughts about, well, what do you do? And so one of the things that happened is, of course, you have what's called the stimulus package. And the reason why the United States just passed this bill, a little bit ago about getting $2 trillion stimulus and giving people money and bailing out companies goes all the way back to, if you, there's this video about commanding heights that you're watching for this class too. And Keynes had this one answer. The economist Keynes had this answer, which is you have to increase effective demand. In other words, when this is all said and done, this pandemic, and people go back to work, the reason they'll be able to go back to work is because there's an effective demand for those products. In other words, people have money in their pocket and they're going to want to go spend it doing something. And the way in which you're able to get money into people's pockets is through the stimulus, because the fact is that handing out money might make people placated and sort of happier or okay and be able to come up with rents and all that. But on an economic, looking at it from the whole economy, the reason why the government's doing it is they know that those people will then spend money and keep the businesses afloat. And so the idea is that you spend public money, government money, in this case, $2 trillion that they're going to spend to just try and put more effective demand out there. And so you have to remember, too, that connected to this, we talked about these different fixes. One thing to watch out for as the recovery from the pandemic goes forward is these 5 fixes. There are going to be people that say, well, we got to recoup this money that we just gave out in all of these stimulus packages, and they'll try to cut more social programs. That's one thing you're going to see. The other is that you're going to see businesses struggling to try and sell things and sell them at a higher clip to be able to make up for lost profits. One of the other things, well, the stimulus itself is a gigantic debt package. It's giving $2 trillion out to people who haven't earned it. It's essentially credit. They're giving it. They're printing out another $2 trillion essentially. Now the question is does this come due at some point, or does it create a debt or a credit crisis? And that's something to look out for. But the other thing is that so many ways of making the economy function again rely on globalization, on different parts of the world reconnecting. Obviously the tourism industry, but also all sorts of trade and things going on. That could be a slow process as borders start to reopen, probably relatively slowly after the pandemic. But the one key thing too is that if you don't have effective demand, if you don't have money in the pockets of people to actually go out and spend it, there's no real economic recovery. And that's why there's not a lot of options and people are coming up with these stimulus packages. And it's not just the US, European governments are doing it as well. Okay. So in the face of these political, economic, and health crises, what is the future of globalization? Well, there's one way we could look at this is maybe we'll de-link more. Maybe we'll kind of become more separate. Our borders will become a little more solid. We won't trade as much and we'll become more self-sufficient country by country because we worry that a disease that crops up, whether it's in China or Africa or Europe or whatever, may come here. Or a disease that develops here in North America may travel to Europe or Asia, and they don't want that. And so maybe the world gets a little more divided. That's one possibility. Or another possibility is that people will see the world and its people as fundamentally interconnected, that there's no way to sort of stop something that happens in one part of the world from really affecting the other. And so in that case, really what we need is more cooperation to kind of manage global problems in a more collaborative sort of way. So that's another potential outcome. And so, in other words, what the future of globalization really hinges on is this last idea, which is when we see disease, when we see poverty, when we see environmental hazards or discrimination or oppression, and we see it going on somewhere else, do we see it as their problem that we have to put up borders and kind of shut ourselves off from, or do we see it as our problem as sort of a collective humanity? Clearly, I tend to, if you've been watching this class throughout the semester, I tend to think that the best way forward is to think about it in sort of the last way, which is that things that go on in different parts of the world are going to affect us. And so it's really our responsibility to think of these as our problems. When a disease first shows up, whether it's in China or Africa, we shouldn't just be shutting ourselves off. We should be trying to fix that problem, because that's more effective than waiting for it to come to our shores and just trying to keep it out, because it doesn't work very well. When we see people on the move and migrating because the place that they're in is experiencing environmental hazards or oppression or warfare, we shouldn't just necessarily shut ourselves off from that problem. We should help to try and solve those problems so that people can continue to live and stay in the places that they find to be their homes and where they want to be. So overall, if there's a kind of lesson that comes out of this class, I hope it's that you've gotten a little better view of just what the world looks like, where things are at, but also how much the world is really interconnected. And then that hopefully in the future, as you go forward in your life, you'll see some value to really understanding the world as more of as an interconnected whole, than that the things that happen in other places do have an effect where you live as well. All right. That's it for the material. Thank you.